I'm from New Hampshire, and this story takes place when I was in my early 20s, living about 30 minutes outside of Manchester. I had just broken up with my girlfriend of 2 years, and it was a confusing time in my life. You know those periods when you're just wandering around trying to figure things out? Maybe looking for meaning without even knowing it? That's exactly where I was. My grandmother was very religious and never missed a church service. She went to liturgy every single Sunday without fail. After my grandfather passed away, I started going to church with her. Part of it was to support her, but if I'm honest, I think I was also looking for something to ground me during that uncertain time in my life. My grandfather had been a decorated veteran, well respected in our community. Everyone knew him, and his death left a huge empty space in my grandmother's life. But even while she was grieving, her faith never wavered. She would tell me with complete certainty in her voice that she knew he was finally with the Lord. I could see how much peace that belief gave her. I really admired that kind of faith, the kind that brings real comfort. It's rare, I think. Some people spend their whole lives searching for that kind of certainty, even if they can't quite explain what they're looking for. Then came that Sunday that changed everything. After the service, I met this girl. Even now, the whole thing feels like something I dreamed up. I had never seen her at church before, which was unusual because our community was small and close-knit, especially at church. She immediately caught my attention. She had these beautiful dark curly hair and the most striking hazel eyes I'd ever seen. I waited until the service was over before approaching her. Yes, I was attracted to her, but I was also just curious about seeing someone new there, especially someone around my age. When we started talking, there was an instant connection. You know what I mean? That spark when you meet someone and just click right away? Her name was Kaylee, and she had this quiet, mysterious way about her that drew me in. Every time I tried to ask her specific questions about her background or family, she would make a joke and tell me I'd have to take her out to dinner to get those answers. I actually enjoyed her playful way of dodging my questions. After some friendly back and forth, she did tell me that her family had recently moved to the area and that she went to college nearby. That explained why I'd never seen her before. By the end of our conversation, I had managed to get her phone number, and I felt that exciting buzz you get when you meet someone special. Over the next week, we texted regularly and connected on social media. I remember looking at her Instagram and being surprised that she had very few followers, but I actually liked that. It seemed more genuine than someone with thousands of followers. As we talked more, she started opening up about her family situation. I don't want to share too many details, but things weren't good at home. Her stepfather was an alcoholic who treated both her and her mother badly, and her biological father was even worse, though she never gave me the specific details. She just said they had to move to get away from him. She had to transfer schools and leave behind everything and everyone she knew. I didn't push her to tell me more about her father. I was just glad she felt comfortable enough to share what she did with me. The following Sunday, I saw her at church again. I took it as a sign and asked her out on a proper date after the service. She didn't hesitate, just smiled and said yes. We made plans to meet later that week. I spent the days leading up to our date thinking about her, feeling those normal first date nerves. When the night finally came, we kept things simple. We went to see a movie, and then got something to eat. Nothing fancy, just a casual evening where we could talk and get to know each other better. The date was going really well. She was an amazing listener, and she seemed genuinely interested in everything I had to say, which felt special. Not wanting the night to end, I suggested we go for a drive after dinner. I thought it would give us a chance to keep talking without the restaurant noise around us. She agreed, so we got on the highway and drove out of town a bit. We were on one of those roads that's technically a highway but looks more like a regular two-lane road, with trees lining both sides. Everything was perfect. It's amazing how quickly things can change. What happened next is something I'll never be able to forget, no matter how hard I try. Out of nowhere, Kaylee started speaking, but it wasn't in English. The words came out fast and mumbled, sounding like French or something similar. At first, I thought maybe she was joking around or testing me, but then I noticed her eyes. They had rolled back in her head, showing only the whites. I swerved the car and nearly crashed into the barrier. My heart was racing because it looked like she was having some kind of seizure or was in a trance. I managed to pull over to the shoulder, trying my best to stay calm even though I was panicking inside. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and called for an ambulance. I didn't know what to tell them except that I thought she was having a seizure. While I waited for help to arrive, I kept checking on her. She seemed completely unaware of where she was. She was still speaking in that strange language, and her head was vibrating in a way that didn't seem humanly possible. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid to touch her, but I felt like I needed to do something. I had never been so scared in my entire life. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. She snapped her head toward me and closed her mouth. Her eyes returned to normal as she blinked, and she gave me this wild, wide-eyed look that I'll never forget as long as I live. Before I could say anything, she threw open the car door and sprinted, and I mean sprinted, full speed into the woods. Let me say that again. She ran straight into the dark woods. I couldn't move. My head was spinning, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stayed frozen in that position until the police and paramedics arrived. I told them everything, even though I knew it sounded completely crazy. I described every detail, the way her eyes had looked, the strange language, how she'd run off into the woods. They nodded and took my statement, promising they would try to find her. I must have looked insane, but they treated me seriously. After that night, Kaylee vanished completely. She never came back to church. Her Instagram account was deleted, and when I tried to call her, I found out she had blocked my number. It was even stranger than that. I got a friend to try texting her number, but it seemed like the number had been completely erased. No matter how much I searched online, I couldn't find any trace of her. I even asked people at church if they knew her or her family, but no one did. It was like she had never existed. To this day, I don't know what happened to Kaylee or who or what she really was. I don't live in New Hampshire anymore, and my memories of home are forever changed because of that night. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember that look in her eyes just before she ran, and I know it was real. Whatever happened that night was real, even if I'll never understand it. I've tried to move on with my life, but there are nights when I lie awake, thinking about what really happened on that dark road. Was she running from something? Or was she something else entirely? I'll probably never know the truth, and maybe that's for the best. But I do know one thing. Sometimes the people we meet aren't who or what they appear to be, and some questions are better left unanswered. My family owns this old 2012 Volvo that's practically falling apart, but for some reason it just refuses to die. The car has been through everything you can imagine, but it keeps on running despite its endless list of problems. The brakes feel mushy when you press them, the engine acts up whenever it feels like it, and half of the electrical systems barely function anymore. My parents are basically just waiting for it to break down completely so they'll have a good reason to buy a new car. Unfortunately, I'm the one who usually ends up driving it. Among all its problems, one of the worst is that the windshield wipers don't work at all. This makes driving in any kind of rain incredibly dangerous. Even a light drizzle is enough to make it impossible to see through the windshield. Living in Nevada, this usually isn't a big problem. Everyone knows Nevada is the driest state in America. I remember my elementary school teachers always making a big deal about this fact, though I never understood why they thought it was so important. This story takes place a couple of summers ago. I had decided to take a solo road trip to visit my friend Kelvin, who lived a few states away. He was one of those childhood friends I hadn't seen in years, and I love driving, so I thought I'd make an adventure out of it. There's something special about driving alone through the empty desert, just you, the road, and your thoughts. The drive to Kelvin's place was perfect. I spent a few nights at his house and we did what old friends do. Stayed up late, had some drinks, caught up on everything we'd missed in each other's lives. It was exactly what I needed, and I was glad I made the effort to visit. The drive back started out just as smoothly as the trip there, but that changed dramatically when I crossed back into Nevada. That's when I saw it. Not just a sprinkle or some light rain, but a full-blown thunderstorm. We're talking lightning bolts cutting across the sky and rain coming down in sheets. I later found out it was one of the heaviest rainfall events Nevada had seen in years. I'd driven through rain before, but nothing like this. Though honestly, with my broken windshield wipers, it didn't really matter how heavy the rain was. Any amount would force me to pull over. So that's what I did, reluctantly. I pulled off the highway and drove a good distance into the desert, wanting to make sure I was far enough from the road that no trucks would accidentally hit me in the poor visibility. I figured I had no choice but to wait out the storm, maybe try to get some sleep in the car while I waited. I thought about calling the police for help, but money was tight, and I knew if they helped me with the wipers, they'd probably end up giving me tickets for all the car's other problems. I also couldn't bring myself to call my parents. They're in their mid-60s, and I wasn't about to ask them to drive 3.5 hours to rescue me. So sitting and waiting was my only option. There I was, alone on the side of the road during a thunderstorm in the middle of the desert. Not a single car passed by for a full hour, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I think being alone in the desert started playing tricks with my mind, because after about another hour, I got this really unsettling feeling. I can't explain exactly what it was, but I had this overwhelming urge to move the car. Of course, with the rain still pouring down, I couldn't do that safely. I found myself nervously looking out each of the car's windows, as if expecting to see something out there. Logically, I knew there was nothing. All I could see were miles and miles of rocks and desert landscape. But the sun was starting to set, which meant soon I wouldn't be able to see anything at all. I hadn't expected the storm to last this long, so the possibility of spending the entire night out in the desert hadn't even crossed my mind until then. I'll admit it, the thought of not being able to see what was out there in the darkness really spooked me. I'm not usually someone who gets scared easily, but I'd heard enough stories about strange things happening in the desert to be reasonably cautious. Just as these thoughts were running through my head, the storm began to ease up a bit. I took this as a good sign, thinking I'd be able to get back on the road soon. The sun continued to set, creating that strange, muted twilight that's unique to the desert. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated its beauty, but the rain just wouldn't stop completely, so I was still stuck there. I tried to distract myself by watching the lightning flashing in the distance, hoping it would calm my nerves. Without any warning, one of them fired a gun into the sky. I jumped so violently I bit down on my lip hard enough to draw blood. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay absolutely still, to make myself invisible behind those rocks. For what felt like hours, I stayed frozen in place, not daring to look out again. Eventually, the curiosity became unbearable. Slowly, carefully, I peered around the rock again, and my stomach dropped. Everything was pitch black. No flashlights, no movement, nothing. I waited, unsure where those people had gone. Then, just like that, the lights were back, flickering around my car again, almost like they were taunting me. I knew I couldn't stay there all night. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I tried to explain what was happening. My voice was barely audible, but the operator assured me they would send someone. I put the phone down, feeling both relieved and terrified. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the blessed glow of police lights in the distance. The second those lights started flashing, the three figures turned and bolted, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. By the time the police car actually pulled up next to my car, they were long gone. I ran through the rain, waving my arms, feeling incredibly grateful to see another human being. The officer listened patiently as I told him everything that had happened. What really unsettled me was that he didn't seem particularly shocked by my story, which somehow made the whole experience feel even worse. He did have the courtesy to wait out the rest of the storm with me and didn't give me any tickets for my car's problems, which I suppose was a small blessing. I think about that night often, trying to make sense of what I saw. Who were those people? What were they doing out there in the middle of nowhere during a storm? Why were they moving so strangely? The officer's lack of surprise makes me wonder if similar things have happened to other people out there in the desert. I haven't done a road trip since that night. Sometimes when it rains, I remember those dancing flashlights in the darkness, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in my car. The desert holds many secrets, and maybe some of them are better left undiscovered. One thing's for certain: I'll never look at a broken-down Volvo or a Nevada thunderstorm the same way again. What I'm about to tell you is the strangest experience I've ever had in my life. My name is Mary, and this happened a few months ago when my friend Carol and I were driving from Florida back to New Jersey. We had been visiting some friends who went to college down in Florida, and while the visit was great, it was time for us to get back to our regular lives. We planned for the drive to be fun, just the two of us on a road trip with plenty of snacks, good music, and time to catch up on everything we hadn't talked about in ages. Looking back, we probably should have stayed one more night at our friend's place, but I was eager to get home. Our plan was ambitious. We wanted to do the entire drive in one shot. We drove through the night and into the next morning. A few hours after sunrise, my back was killing me from sitting in the same position for so long. I told Carol we should find somewhere to stop, get some gas, maybe grab something to eat, and take a proper break before getting back on the road. We passed a few exits before finally pulling off at what was supposed to be a lively tourist town. For some reason, I can't remember the name of the place, no matter how hard I try. It was one of those places you'd expect to be a tourist stop, with signs everywhere pointing to attractions and promising unique shops and local history. But something felt wrong the moment we pulled in. The streets were completely empty, and all the buildings looked worn down and tired. Too run down for a place that was supposedly catering to visitors. It's hard to explain exactly what was wrong. You know how sometimes you can feel that something isn't right even if you can't put your finger on why? That's exactly how this felt. Have you ever driven through one of those ghost towns where all the shop signs are still up, but everything is clearly abandoned? That's what this place felt like, except things weren't actually abandoned. They just looked like they should be. It wasn't your typical spooky, haunted kind of feeling. It was something else entirely, something that's been stuck in my mind ever since. Our first stop was a convenience store. We had to drive for a while before we actually reached what seemed to be the heart of the town, or whatever you'd call it. We pulled over to stretch our legs and get some refreshments. The store looked normal enough inside. Carol was looking for a specific drink she wanted but got frustrated when she couldn't find it. She can be a bit dramatic sometimes, so I just went along with her complaints and agreed to try somewhere else. I still wanted my Gatorade though, so I went to pay for it. The cashier was a woman who looked about 30 or 35. She had dark brown hair and was fairly tall. Everything about her seemed perfectly normal. The only reason I particularly noticed her appearance was because she was wearing suspenders, which isn't something you see every day. I paid for my drink and we left. Carol spotted another convenience store right across the street, so we decided to try our luck there. But when we walked into the second store, I felt my stomach drop. The cashier behind the counter looked exactly like the woman from the first store. Same hair, same face, same height, same everything. I stood there frozen, staring at her. I could tell I was making her uncomfortable, but I couldn't help it. Finally, I asked her if she had a twin sister or something. She gave me this strange, skeptical look and said she didn't have a twin, that she was an only child. She narrowed her eyes and told me it was a weird thing to ask, which I guess it was. I tried to explain myself, but she just went quiet after that. I felt this overwhelming sense of déjà vu and practically dragged Carol out of the store with me. Carol was confused, so I explained what I'd seen and asked if she'd noticed the same thing. She said she couldn't remember what the first cashier looked like and suggested I was probably just tired from driving all night. But I knew what I'd seen. I was determined to prove it, so we ran back to the first store. But when we got there, the person inside looked completely different. She was short with light hair and looked middle-aged. There was absolutely no way anyone could have confused her with the other cashier. They didn't even look like they were in the same age group. It was like I had imagined the whole thing. Carol tried to convince me to forget about it, saying I was just exhausted, but I knew I wasn't imagining things. Eventually, I had to let it go, but I was desperate to get out of there. We still needed gas though, so we pulled into the first station we saw. The place was completely empty, just our car, the pumps, and a small building in the back where you pay. We were literally the only ones there. We went inside, and Carol took her time looking for her drink again, but of course, they didn't have it. I paid, waited for her, and we left. We couldn't have been in there for more than a minute or two, but as we walked out, I got that weird feeling in my gut again. What had been a completely empty gas station just moments ago was now packed full of cars and people. Every single pump had a car, with more waiting in line like it was rush hour at the busiest station in the state. Even all the parking spots in the back lot were full. To make it even stranger, it felt like everyone was staring at us as we walked to our car. I've never felt more uncomfortable in my life. This time, Carol agreed that something bizarre was happening. I could tell we both felt the same eerie suspicion, like we'd stepped out of reality for a moment, and when we came back, everything had shifted slightly. We decided to forget about finding food and just focus on getting back to the highway. I'd lost my appetite anyway. Back on the road, we didn't talk much at first. I wasn't exactly scared, but that bad feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. It's hard to even explain the sensation. As we got a bit further from town, Carol and I started talking about how weird everything had been. While we were discussing it, a Toyota Sienna passed us. I remember it clearly because it had this huge spiderweb crack running through the windshield, and the side was all scratched up. It was pretty hard to miss. Carol made some joke about it, though I can't remember exactly what she said. Just as we were starting to relax a bit, everything got even stranger. About 10 minutes later, the exact same minivan passed us again. We were both absolutely certain it was the same one. It was impossible to miss with that massive crack in the windshield. But how was that possible? We had been driving straight ahead at a pretty fast speed. There's no way it could have gotten ahead of us again. But what were the odds of seeing two different Siennas with identical damage? Carol started saying, "Oh my God," over and over, and I could tell she was close to having a panic attack. She begged me to drive faster, which I did. I was terrified inside, but I had to keep it together, both as the driver and for Carol's sake. All I wanted was to get back on the highway and leave that place behind forever. When I glanced down at the GPS, I saw that an hour had somehow passed since we'd left the gas station, which was absolutely impossible. I wanted to tell Carol about it, but I didn't think she could handle any more weird stuff. My heart was pounding, but I just kept driving. Part of me was worried the GPS would start taking us in circles. We finally made it back to the highway, and that's where the nightmare ended. By the time we got home, however many hours later, it felt like we were waking up from some strange, disjointed dream. I'm not exaggerating when I say that the whole experience still feels dreamlike when I think about it. People usually look at me strangely when I tell them this story. I still can't explain what happened there, and honestly, I don't expect to ever find an explanation. I've done some research online about weird occurrences in places like that, and I've actually found a handful of stories similar to mine. The weirdest thing about the whole experience was that feeling in my gut that I still have trouble describing. Until that day, I didn't really understand what it meant to get a bad vibe from something. It's like every bone in your body is screaming at you to notice that something isn't right. I never want to experience that feeling again. Sometimes I wonder if that town is still there, or if anyone else has had similar experiences in that place. But I'll never go back to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some places are better left unexplored. All I know is that whenever I'm on a road trip now, I'm very careful about which exits I choose to take.